Over 2 weeks in 1940, a military miracle unfolded here in Dunkirk. The evacuation of 300,000 troops, cut off and trapped by a rampaging German army. But it was very nearly a disaster that knocked Britain out of the war and handed victory in Europe to the Nazis.
I'm JJ Chalmers, a former Royal Marine and a veteran of the war in Afghanistan.
Over 3 programmes, I'll be charting those momentous 14 days, day by day, hour by hour. In France, I'll be retracing the steps of those heroic men who made the evacuation possible.
Artillery slammed off the bunker.
Using my own experiences, I'll relive some of the horrors they faced.
Nothing prepares you for a moment of extreme trauma like that.
The real story of Dunkirk goes far beyond the familiar tales of beaches and little ships.
I'm Raksha Dave, and I'm finding out just how the rescue mission was planned and executed.
Revealing how tenacity and ingenuity overcame overwhelming odds.
23 people on this tiny boat.
This time, the Second World War has been underway for 8 months, and the British Army in France is retreating, following Germany's ferocious blitzkrieg attack. They're battered and bloodied, and now must fight against overwhelming odds to prevent the Nazis cutting off their only escape route back to Britain. Only their heroism and sacrifice will make the most extraordinary evacuation in history possible.
These are the 14 days that saved Britain.
Here in Dunkirk, on the 2nd of June 1940, the last of over 200,000 British soldiers trapped in France stepped onto a boat and headed home. It was the culmination of the greatest rescue mission in British history. But it was only made possible by events that began 14 days earlier and 50 miles inland. On the 20th of May 1940, the exhausted men of the Royal Norfolk Regiment were trudging across these very fields. Like all the men of the BEF, the British Expeditionary Force in France, they'd been retreating for 4 days, enduring a relentless German onslaught.
One of those soldiers was Private Ernie Leggett. He said they were like vagabonds, filthy and reduced to drinking water from the ditches.
Leggett was 20 and from a tiny village in Norfolk. His family were poor and he joined the army at just 15, hoping for a better life. A crack shot, he'd been in France since the outbreak of the war, but now, for the first time, he was under attack.
Over to the north, Private Leggett could see the town of Tournai burning. It had been relentlessly dive-bombed by German aircraft that were hounding British forces constantly during their retreat.
Leggett had seen many of his comrades and countless civilian refugees killed by the German bombers.
Now, I never faced an enemy that had aircraft, but having been on the other side, laying 500 meters away, to be on the receiving end of a earth-shattering, deep explosion that tears the landscape to pieces, reduces buildings to rubble, that is terrifying beyond imagination.
But today, Leggett and his pals were about to have the chance to fight back.
Leggett and his regiment, the Royal Norfolks, had been ordered to put up a stand, to make a defensive line in an effort to hold back the relentless German assault.
The German invasion of France had begun 10 days earlier. The BEF were supporting the huge French army, but Nazi tanks managed to punch a hole through the Allies' defences and raced towards the French coast. The British Army became almost completely surrounded and retreated to the River Escaut. Here, they'd make a desperate attempt to hold back the Germans. This is the stretch of the Escaut that Private Leggett and his comrades from the Royal Norfolk Regiment were ordered to defend that day.
Leggett set up his machine gun on the second floor balcony of a disused cement factory. The Germans would have to cross this river, and it was his regiment's job to stop them, or at the very least, delay them. Now, as a defender, decisions you make ahead of the battle make all of the difference. It's the difference between achieving your objective or not, and staying alive.
As Leggett set up his position, he had no idea how desperate his situation was. But the commander of the British Army in France, 55-year-old aristocrat, General Lord Gort, knew exactly how bad things were.
Gort was a hero of the First World War. He won the Victoria Cross. He'd won the Distinguished Service Order 3 times. What he wasn't, really, was a great strategist.
But on this occasion, Gort could clearly see his army needed to pull back to the French coast, because if they couldn't stop the Germans, evacuation to Britain would be their only option.
The job of Private Leggett and the rest of the regiment lined out here along the Escaut was to hold back the Germans for long enough that as many of the 200,000 soldiers of the BEF could retreat the 50 miles back to French ports on the English Channel.
Back in London, at the Admiralty, they were discussing the disturbing possibility of having to rapidly evacuate the entire British Army by sea. It was decided a plan needed to be prepared, to be used if necessary. They wanted to be ready to lift 10,000 troops a day from the 3 main Channel ports.
At this stage, you still have 3 ports in the hands of the Allies. You've got Calais, you've got Boulogne, and you've got Dunkirk. So, of course, the best of those, if there is going to be an evacuation, is Calais, because that's, the nearest to England.
But not everyone believed an evacuation would be needed, especially the new Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, who'd been in power for just 10 days.
When Churchill becomes Prime Minister on the 10th of May 1940, his entire rhetoric, his entire career was building up to this very moment. There's no way that Churchill's first act as Prime Minister is to run away. That is simply not in his DNA.
But Churchill wasn't a fool and agreed that evacuation plans should be made, just in case.
The job of preparing for that possible mass evacuation was given to 57-year-old Vice Admiral Bertram Ramsay, who'd only recently been recalled from retirement. That evening, Ramsay held his first planning meeting here in his headquarters at Dover Castle in Kent.
Admiral Ramsay's HQ wasn't in the castle itself, it's underneath it.
This secret complex of bunkers became the subterranean nerve centre for the potential mission, which was given the code name Operation Dynamo. The first challenge Ramsay and his team faced was sourcing enough ships to carry out an evacuation on this vast scale. I'm meeting historian Philip Weir in the actual room where that first planning meeting was held.
This whole place must have been absolutely buzzing with people.
Yeah, on the 20th of May, this was an incredibly busy day.
So how did Admiral Ramsay plan for the evacuation? He didn't know whether it was going to happen or not, so what was he doing?
He sits down in here with his small team of staff and starts planning numbers of ships you're going to need, calling the Ministry of Shipping, calling in the Admiralty, calling in absolutely everybody.
Although some Royal Navy ships would be available to help with any evacuation, Ramsay realised very quickly that these wouldn't be anywhere near enough.
What he's now got to do is spread the net a lot wider if he really thinks the whole army's got to come home.
Well, that's the thing, isn't it? Because we're not just talking about hundreds of people, we're talking about tens of thousands. So what kind of ships was Admiral Ramsay looking for at this time?
What he's looking for is reasonably large ships that can go into ports, tie up alongside, quickly fill up with people and head out.
But Churchill hoped these ships would never be needed. He was pinning all his hopes on men like Ernie Leggett at the old cement factory, who were preparing to face a savage German onslaught.
Clearly, in one sense, these soldiers are being sacrificed, particularly as they're often being told to fight to the last man. They're told, effectively, that they are being sacrificed for the greater good.
Because if Private Leggett and the other troops along the River Escaut could hold back the German assault, the following day a counter-strike had been ordered that could turn the tables on the Nazis.
It was an heroic and desperate plan, but would it work? On the 21st of May 1940, the British Army's position in France was becoming increasingly desperate. They faced suffering such a terrible defeat that victory in Europe looked like it could be handed to the Nazis. The British were now almost entirely encircled by the rampaging Germans. It seemed almost inevitable that within days, over 200,000 British soldiers in France would be overrun and captured or killed.
Amongst the soldiers tasked with holding back the relentless German advance was Private Leggett and his exhausted comrades of the Royal Norfolk Regiment. They were defending this stretch of river in front of an old disused cement factory, and Leggett was on the second floor manning a machine gun.
In the early hours, the German assault on the River Escaut began with a brutal artillery barrage. Then German soldiers came into sight. The bridge in front of Leggett was damaged and the Germans began to repair it. But Leggett's commanding officer, Captain Barclay, told his men to hold fire.
The Germans on the other side of the river had no idea that the Norfolks were here. Barclay waited as 25 Germans crossed the bridge that they'd only just repaired before giving the order to open fire to his men with a blast of his hunting bugle that he carried on him. A hail of gunfire landed on the Germans, mowing down all the men that had crossed the bridge and even some on the other side.
For 7 hours, Leggett and the Royal Norfolks valiantly held off the assault.
But now the Germans brought tanks and artillery up to the river. A shell exploded right next to Captain Barclay and severely wounded him in the gut. However, he ordered that he be strapped to a door and 4 men would carry him so that he could continue to oversee the defence.
As the fighting continued that afternoon, Barclay was overcome by pain and passed out.
Whilst Barclay's selfless courage was unbelievable, it also shows you just how significant the situation at large was. He was wounded, his life hung in the balance, but his mission meant that the lives of tens, if not hundreds of thousands of men, well, their lives hung in the balance too, and it was their job to hold this line and give them a fighting chance.
Despite their heroism, the soldiers of the Royal Norfolks were being overwhelmed. Of the 25 men who'd taken up positions in the cement factory that morning, only Leggett and 3 of his pals were still standing.
Suddenly, Leggett himself was hit by an explosion. A mortar had come through the roof. He said, "I couldn't move my legs and my back was absolutely numb from the waist down. All I saw was blood all over the floor." A
piece of shrapnel had passed right through 20-year-old Ernie Leggett's body. Sadly, I know only too well what that's like.
Nothing prepares you for a moment of extreme trauma like that. The wash of emotions and feelings that comes across you in a split second is like nothing I ever hope to experience again in my life. You're confused, you can't believe it's happened to you, you are in pain. And all of this is happening in a split second, and it is happening when chaos continues to ensue around you.
Leggett and Barclay were taken from the front line and put onto hospital trains heading towards the coast. Soon after, hundreds of German soldiers flooded across the river, forcing the surviving Royal Norfolks to retreat again. While the British were desperately fighting to defend the line on the Escaut, the German tanks had continued to advance in the south. Soon, they reached the coast. The British Army was now surrounded. Then, the Germans began pushing north towards the Channel ports. If they could capture them, the British would have no way to evacuate. But Churchill still believed an evacuation may not be needed. He was pinning his hopes on an alternative plan. He ordered Gort to launch a counterattack. And if it worked, it might just turn defeat into victory. This plan was to punch through the Germans and link up with the French forces to the south. If they could pull it off, the British would no longer be surrounded. And the German forces that had reached the coast would themselves be trapped.
If this counterattack could be a total success, there would have been a very different ending to this story.
At 2 p.m. on the 21st of May, 74 British tanks launched the last-ditch counterattack south of the town of Arras.
As the British tanks advanced, they saw the countryside in front of them covered in German troops streaming towards the coast.
They were a powerful Panzer tank division led by the famous general Erwin Rommel.
Erwin Rommel was a favourite of Hitler, and this really was where he made his mark.
Supporting Rommel's tanks were soldiers from the infamous SS Totenkopf division. These were Nazi fanatics. Many had only recently been concentration camp guards.
The German divisions were taken completely by surprise. The British tanks tore through them, causing panic, mayhem, and destruction.
The SS Totenkopf soldiers suffered terrible casualties, and many fled in panic. It was an incredibly close call for General Rommel. An officer stood right next to him was shot dead. A British tank rolled right up to him, but the driver had been killed, and for the rest of the crew, rather than attacking, they surrendered. But it is incredible to think just how different the history of World War II would have been if Rommel had died that day. But Rommel managed to rally his troops, and the vastly outnumbered British just couldn't break through the German encirclement. As night fell, they were forced to retreat. But the Nazis suffered their first major scare of the war. And now Dunkirk had become the only possible place the British Army could escape back to Britain. The Germans had continued to push north towards the Channel port towns. They had almost surrounded Boulogne and were rapidly closing in on Calais, which looked certain to soon fall.
The only place that an evacuation can ultimately take place from is now Dunkirk.
You've now only got one port to evacuate hundreds of thousands of men. And of all three, frankly, Dunkirk is the least suitable. I mean, for the obvious reason that it's the furthest from England.
In Britain, Admiral Ramsay was rapidly having to adapt his plans for an evacuation that now seemed to be a matter of not if, but when. I'm meeting historian Harry Bennett to find out more.
This is such a great view of Dover. You can see the port, you can even see the coast of France in the distance.
It's all too close for comfort. Ramsay can see the flashes on the far side of the channel. He can hear the explosions in the distance, and at night you can see the flames of Calais. He realises that things could unfold very, very quickly indeed.
But with Churchill still hesitating to give the evacuation order, Ramsay was taking the initiative.
He's already begun to realise that if he goes through normal channels, if he does it by the book, it could be too late. So under his own authority, he begins to assemble the kind of vessels which are capable of carrying men, at least, across the English Channel.
It must have been quite a sight. How many vessels would have been stationed here?
Obviously, what they don't want to do is pack it so full of shipping that it becomes an immediate target for the German Air Force. Because if Dover is heavily bombed, Dover becomes inoperable. So you've actually got vessels which are sort of up and down the coast here. Places like Ramsgate, places like Sheerness, they're being quietly assembled, ready for when the order for Operation Dynamo is given.
So Churchill hasn't given him the order yet. He's just getting all of his ducks in a row, just getting prepared for imminent action.
I think Ramsay realises the way that this is going to go. The longer that order takes to come, maybe the less people we're going to have the chance to get away. So there is a kind of element of frustration, I think, on Ramsay's part in terms of when will the order come.
On the ground in France, General Gort also believed an evacuation was inevitable. The counterattack had failed and the Germans were over the River Escaut. The majority of the over 200,000 British soldiers were now in headlong retreat towards Dunkirk, which was 50 miles away.
These roads heading towards the port were completely clogged with troops. Now, some of them were lucky enough to be in trucks, but for a lot of them, they were exhausted on foot, marching. It was painfully slow going. And in some places, well, order was breaking down.
They were on the run, effectively. A lot of people were living off the land. You know, they were short of supplies, short of ammunition. Some were, moving back with their boots worn out and their feet like liver.
This shattered, retreating British army had to somehow be protected from the Germans, who were now pushing forward on all fronts. And Gort came up with a plan. He would create a 15-mile wide corridor that could be defended on both sides by some of his soldiers. He hoped these troops could hold back the Germans just long enough for the majority of his army to stream down the corridor to Dunkirk. The soldiers, given the unenviable task of protecting the corridor, were heading to their assigned locations, such as this hilltop town of Cassel. The plan was to fortify the town, turning it into a defensive strongpoint to protect the retreating army. Well, it's clear from up here why Cassel is the perfect location to defend. You can see for miles around. Any German troop movement out there is going to be much easier to spot. And with this extra elevation, your artillery has more distance and is all the more lethal. But with the Germans advancing relentlessly, the odds were heavily stacked against the British army. One of Lord Gort's senior commanders wrote in his diary, "Nothing but a miracle can save the BEF now." The majority of the shattered British army in France was in headlong retreat along these roads, hoping desperately to reach the port of Dunkirk for a possible mass evacuation. Exhausted and hungry, they were forced to loot food from bombed-out shops and houses.
Worst of all, as they trudged along these roads, they were under endless attack from the air by the Luftwaffe. Soldiers and civilians alike were taking terrible losses.
The Stuka dive bomber was fitted with what was called a Jericho's trumpet, this specific siren under its wings, and it made a wailing sound as air passed through it. So it created that distinctive screeching banshee's wail.
These were really a devilish invention. They were almost more a psychological weapon. You could hear them coming before you could see them. And some people used to go into their own heads when they heard this terrible noise, knowing that this death was coming down.
The British soldiers were defenceless against these horrifying bombers as they continued their attacks.
One of the constant refrain from troops was, "Where were the RAF?" They felt abandoned and believed the RAF were failing in their duty to defend them.
To discover if this was the truth, I've come to the Imperial War Museum, Duxford.
Duxford is home to a Spitfire that actually flew during the Dunkirk retreat and is still flying today.
I'm meeting author and historian Claire Mully, who can tell me more.
Did the soldiers on the ground feel that the RAF had abandoned them?
It's true that the soldiers felt that, but it's not true that that's what happened at all. The RAF was doing patrols, but the men on the ground didn't see them because there was a lot of cloud cover and the RAF were flying above the clouds, and a lot of the patrols had gone much further inland and they were just out of visibility.
So what British aircraft were defending the troops?
This is the first time that we see the use of the Supermarine Spitfire in operational action. First time a Spitfire encountered a German Messerschmitt 109 was on the 23rd of May 1940, and it was piloted by this young 23-year-old New Zealander, Alan Deer. Alan Deer was this square-jawed 1940s hero. He flew out in a Spitfire over the Channel towards Dunkirk to provide cover, and he encountered and engaged a Messerschmitt 109. So this is the cream of the Luftwaffe's fighting force. The German pilot didn't really know what he was up against. He banked round and went into a high ascent. And Alan Deer just said that he signed his own death warrant because the Spitfire, its great asset was manoeuvrability. And he engaged and took him straight out. He took out a second 109 on the same mission. He went back, they refueled, came out a third time on the same day, and took out a third ME 109. Extraordinary achievement, 3 hits on a single day.
It's pretty incredible, isn't it? It sounds like something from Top Gun. It's pretty remarkable.
Alan Deer that day really showed what the Spitfire could do.
If all of a sudden they have this amazing piece of tech that can outmaneuver German fighters, how did they not prevent the bombing of Dunkirk?
It's a matter of statistics. The Luftwaffe completely outnumbered the RAF. They just didn't have enough numbers.
Despite the RAF's valiant efforts, by that evening in France, the situation had become catastrophic. British soldiers were still making their way to Cassel and other strongpoints along Gort's corridor. From here, they hoped to protect the rest of the retreating army flooding towards Dunkirk. But Dunkirk itself was about to fall. The German tanks had continued to push up the coast. Boulogne and Calais were now effectively surrounded, The British continued to defend these ports in hope of slowing down the Germans. But the German tanks bypassed them and were now rolling almost unchecked towards Dunkirk. It seemed this last escape route open to the British Army would be severed within a day. But that evening, a miracle happened. Hitler ordered his troops, who at that point were surging forward to Dunkirk, to stop. And not only that, he dictated that they wouldn't push forward for another 3 days. Hitler was worried his panzer tanks were now too vulnerable.
It certainly was a great stroke of luck for the British, because they probably would have been overrun had those tanks not stopped. Hitler certainly was nervous about the fact that, these tanks could be put out of action. So it did make sense, a certain amount of sense, in the circumstances. You just had the Arras counterattack, which had shown how vulnerable these tanks could be.
Yeah, it's fine, chucking a panzer forward as fast as it can, but hold on, everyone else has got to catch up. You've got to get the fuel there, you've got to feed those people. The more you're stretched like an elastic band, the more vulnerable you are to counterattack.
Hitler feared if there was a second British counterattack, it may succeed. And Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, had convinced him he didn't need to risk his precious tanks.
Göring thought that they wouldn't need to launch the Panzers in for that final kill, because the Luftwaffe, particularly with its deadly Stuka dive bombers, could finish the job for Hitler.
Göring telephoned Hitler and said, "You know that the Luftwaffe, we can destroy the British Expeditionary Force. So we can destroy it in Dunkirk."
Hitler's order to halt reached the German frontline troops the following morning. Just as the soldiers assigned to defend Gort's corridor began to arrive at the strongpoint of Cassel. They didn't know it, but now they had some breathing space to set up their defences. But much of the town already lay in ruin. The arriving soldiers discovered that the town had been horrifically bombed by the Luftwaffe in the previous days. As they entered through this medieval gateway, they found a horrific and distressing scene. The area was littered with corpses of mules, and next to them, their Indian handlers. They were troops of the Indian contingent who had been tragically targeted by bombing 2 days earlier.
The Indian contingent formed part of what was known as the Royal Indian Army Service Corps. And principally, these men were mule handlers. The British Expeditionary Force was a highly mechanized army. But really, when they got to France, they discovered that the land was so boggy that they couldn't use the trucks. And so they had to look all the way to Empire and to India to bring in the trained mule handlers 7,000 miles away to assist them in sending supplies to frontline troops.
These mule handlers had been retreating through Cassel 2 days earlier, also heading for Dunkirk. Like so many others, many of them had fallen prey to the Nazi dive bombers. The following day, the survivors of that Indian contingent unit arrived here in Dunkirk. While Churchill still believed the British Army should stay and fight in France, the wounded and support soldiers, like the surviving mule handlers, were already being evacuated.
The men were told to leave behind their mules, and this was quite a tragic moment for them. They would have formed a very close bond with them, almost as though the mule was their pet. The men were truly distraught to have to leave behind these animals that they were so fond of.
And even in Dunkirk, they were still being ruthlessly targeted by the Luftwaffe.
One of them, Lance Corporal Chowdhury Mohammed, described what they suffered. The German planes were like terrible birds, flying overhead, firing on us. I hadn't slept for 15 days. We didn't think we'd come out of there alive. The whole of Dunkirk was alight. Private Ernie Leggett, who'd been badly injured defending the cement factory on the River Escaut, finally made it to Dunkirk that day. He was sheltering in the sand dunes. Leggett was coming in and out of consciousness, but he described what he remembered. I woke up on a stretcher with nothing on but an old blanket and dirty bandages. It was hazy, but I remember bombs were dropping very close and people jumped on top of me to protect me from the blasts. That's comradeship. Actually, one of the only memories I have from the day that I was wounded was one of my friends crouching over the top of me to protect my wounds from getting full of more debris and dirt. Now, that wasn't from bombs dropping, that was from the downdraft of a helicopter coming in to evacuate me, because that's the big difference. And also, when I was hurt, within 1 hour, I was on the operating table in a hospital. Leggett, on the other hand, days later, is on a beach, and whilst he's made it to the beach, his journey is far from over, and he's still very much in danger. Luckily, that afternoon, Leggett was evacuated home on a hospital ship. The ship the Indian contingent unit were supposed to take was sunk by German bombers, but they also made it safely back to Britain on a second ship. The vast majority of the 200,000 plus British soldiers hadn't even made it to Dunkirk, and Churchill was still refusing to order their mass evacuation. For now, their lives hung in the balance. In the medieval hilltop town of Cassel, 40 miles inland from Dunkirk, troops of the Royal Gloucestershire Regiment were digging in, preparing to face a vicious German assault. Their mission was to protect General Gort's corridor, down which the majority of the British Army were streaming towards Dunkirk. They were ordered to fight to the last bullet or the last man.
They were defending points where they had the upper hand. The Germans had to attack them, and they were dug in. But they were aware that there was a great chance that they weren't going to get away, that they were going to have to sacrifice themselves.
One 22-year-old junior officer, Second Lieutenant Roy Creswell, was ordered to take his platoon of 12 men to defend this huge half-built bunker just north of Cassel. So this place was meant to be an anti-aircraft defence, but when Creswell arrived, it hadn't been finished. In fact, unlike today, there wasn't even a door. Wow. Well, when the British first arrived here, what they found is it was full of civilians, French and Belgian refugees who were taking shelter. Now, unfortunately, they had to ask them to leave as they readied the position for the impending German onslaught.
The halt order had been holding the Germans back. You had these panzer divisions that were absolutely straining at the leash to go.
But the British and the French didn't know that the German tanks and troops had halted. For soldiers like Lieutenant Roy Creswell and the 12 men based in this bunker, they were expecting to be attacked by an overwhelming force at any moment. And they knew they were expected to fight to the last man or the last bullet. Back in Britain, the public weren't aware quite how desperate the situation was for soldiers like Roy Creswell. But even the heavily censored papers
couldn't completely conceal the catastrophe unfolding in France.
The people of Britain know this is difficult. You know, we are in a really, really difficult situation.
A national day of prayer had been called that day. Millions, including Churchill, attended services across the country to pray for Britain's deliverance from the Nazis.
It's a real insight into the mind of the country at this particular moment. To me, this is a sense that all that remains now is hope. I think it's quite telling that Churchill goes from the church service where all that's left is hope. Hope is invoked. And he gives the order for the start of Operation Dynamo. So now the evacuation can begin.
At 6:57 that evening, Ramsay and his team in their bunker under Dover Castle received an order from the Admiralty saying, Operation Dynamo is to commence. They'd had just 7 days to prepare for the biggest evacuation in military history.
So when Churchill does finally give the off, what's the first ship that goes over?
Within 2 hours, just after 9:15 that evening, the first ship, Mona's Isle, is sailing from below us, down here, headed for Dunkirk.
And what kind of ship is Mona's Isle?
She's an Isle of Man Steam Packet Company steamer. She's used to carrying pleasure passengers to and from the Isle of Man. And she's going to bring the first mass contingents home.
How many soldiers did Ramsay and Churchill believe they could evacuate?
Simply as many as possible. They thought maybe the low tens of thousands, maybe 35,000, something like 10% of the force.
10%? The chances aren't great, are they?
Yeah, that's going to be an horrendous scale of loss.
While the vast majority of the British Army were still retreating down Gort's corridor towards the coast. Here in Dunkirk, thousands of shattered soldiers had started to stream into the town. At 4 a.m, Mona's Isle made it into Dunkirk's harbour. The harbour had been damaged by German bombing, but it was still usable. Mona's Isle tied up on the quayside, and as the skies lightened, Dunkirk came under its most intense aerial bombardment so far. Goering's planned annihilation of the port from the air had begun. Mona's Isle managed to make it away with 1,420 soldiers on board and headed home. But the Germans were now just 15 miles down the coast. Their artillery opened fire on the ship. Then she was attacked by the Luftwaffe. Mona's Isle limped back across the channel, but 23 people on board were killed and a further 60 were wounded. This was a terrible foretaste of the deadly pounding that rescue ships would take in the coming days. Next time, carnage is unleashed as the enormous evacuation begins. Ships lined up here were sitting targets for German bombers.
It's a ruin. It's a smoking pit.
I get a small taste of the horrors the British faced. I'm only out here for a couple of minutes. These men were out here for nights on end. And witness the ruthlessness of the Nazis. Bullets tore through the crowd of men, the troops. Will the British soldiers ever make it home?
Brand new next Saturday at 9:30. And delving into another war hero, Churchill Path to Victory, is tomorrow at 8 over on 5 Select. Next tonight here on Channel 5, our very own Yorkshire vet relives a fierce feline battle as we look back on when TV goes horribly wrong.